edition of Redistricting Radar, our season one finale. We've run through all of the states and ahead of the census results and ahead of the own redistricting proposals and our own updates to the Redistricting Radar project on electionsdaily.com. This will be our last show of Redistricting Radar for a while. We've got four really good states to cover, though, that are all interesting in their own way, smaller states, but ones that are influential and are important in a lot of ways in terms of who can control the House and where we see this chamber going forward. And I'll, here are some, in case you can't read the title, we've got Utah, we've got Virginia, we've got, not Wyoming. They're never going to have a second district. We got Wisconsin, and we got Washington State. These are really good states to follow, and they're actually pretty important. So I guess we'll go ahead and throw it right into Utah, which is one of the most interesting states in the country. It is a very strange state in a lot of ways and also a pretty normal state in a lot of others. In many ways, its politics are the most traditionally normal of any state in the country. Utah is a very moderate conservative state dominated by Republicans who are conservatives, but who are also fairly moderate and who are definitely more on the Mitt Romney side of things. They're conservative, but they're willing to make deals and they're willing to work with the Democratic minority. The exception to this is in redistricting, which is interesting. So basically, Utah has traditionally had a legislative model where the legislature passes maps and the governor can veto them or not. Utah has Republican governors almost exclusively and a very Republican legislature with virtually no Democrats. Thanks to the strong Republican Mormon support in Utah. Most of the Democrats in the state are, in fact, Protestants who live around Salt Lake City. Protestants or nuns, as they're like to be called more recently. Republicans have control of the process in theory, but there is a new wrinkle. It's an independent redistricting commission, which will be able to propose advisory maps. So these will be maps that are not binding, but which can be used for public pressure into drawing a different map. Now, a couple of things to know about Utah. It's one of the most Republican states in the country by far. This is a state that every single county voted for Mitt Romney, for example, in 2012. 2004, it was George Bush's best state. He won it by a resounding margin of victory of like 46 points. Obama and Biden are the only two Democratic candidates in recent memory who have been able to crack even 30% of the vote. In fact, Biden's 38%
for a Democrat since LBJ.
Yeah. But what it's worth noting is that Biden was the first Democrat to hit 37% of the vote in a very, very long time. This is the best Democratic performance here in a while because Trump is not popular. For those who followed 2016, it was considered a swing state because of the presence of an independent third-party candidate, Evan McMullin, who at the time was considered a conservative and who ran a very conservative campaign against Donald Trump from the right, which really appealed to Mormons and Mormon conservatives, especially around places like Provo, Utah County, a lot of places, Salt Lake County. He did very, very well, and he managed to get 21% of the vote. Hillary Clinton got about 27% of the vote, which wasn't really much better than Obama got, and Donald Trump won only 45%. 2020 comes around, Trump wins the state by 20 points, but it's still a fairly weak margin by historic standards. What does this mean? Well, it means that the congressional districts became more competitive. Traditionally, the 4th district is the new district. I believe it was the 3rd district. Jim Matheson, or 2nd district, sorry, was the Democratic representative for forever in the 2nd district. If you look at the map right here, he represented this district right here, which contained Salt Lake City, St. George, and some rural areas around the rest of the state. He was very popular and won re-election until 2014 when he was defeated by Mia Love. Mia Love proved to be a habitual underperformer in a seat that Mitt Romney won by 37 points. She managed to lose the district in 2018 to Democrat Ben McAdams, and then Ben McAdams lost the seat to Burgess Owens, the first African-American, oddly enough, the first African-American male representative from the district, but the second in the history of
I just wanted to note that Matheson actually retired in 2014 because his district was so inhospitable.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Doug Owens ran against in 2014, and then in 2016. Ben McAdams narrowly beat Mia Love, and then Burgess Owens barely beat McAdams, while Trump carried the district by about 9 points. So this is a state that's a little bit more Democratic federally down ballot. To answer
It's
a question
been a
real quick.
bloodbath district. The 4th district really has been a knife fight seat.
Yeah. Now, to answer the question here from Matthew Tarr, was race a factor in Love and Owens underperforming by a ton? I think this draws into stereotypes about Mormons that aren't really accurate today. You could make an argument for that, but I don't think it's the case. I think it's just genuinely that Utah voters are generally more moderate and are more willing to have moderate representatives, especially ones who have portions of Salt Lake County, as the current map does. It's also worth noting Ben McAdams is a very conservative by most standards House Democrat. Matheson was also a very conservative member of the House as far as
Even more
Democrats go.
so than
The
Adams.
McAdams, yeah. Also, it's worth noting McAdams was the former mayor of Salt Lake County, which is one of the two the only major Democratic area in the state. So I think those are more important factors than race. The fact, in fact, that they've elected two African American representatives in a state that is almost exclusively white is quite telling, and I think it's fairly admirable, given a lot of other states have never had an African American representative. They've had two recently. The fact that it's in the competitive seat doesn't really matter so much to me. Now, before we go into my map and the maps that we're talking about here, is I wanted to show here a misconception about the map, which is that Salt Lake County is split three ways. Salt Lake City, though, is not butchered. In fact, it doesn't need to be butchered. There's a tiny little portion of Salt Lake City, you'll notice here, in the fourth district, but it's really just seems like for population balancing. Really, what the map does is it does butcher these cities, or not butchers. It splits West Valley City, a couple other more democratic cities from Salt Lake County, and then moves them in with more conservative areas in the southern portion of the state. Not Provo, but specific areas around, southern rural counties. So it's more of an urban-rural divide than it is a Salt Lake City is butchered, because really the city hasn't been butchered. The city is intact. In fact, you don't need to split the city to make a Republican map. You can make a very, very Republican map, which would elect Republicans that the people there would be fairly happy with in terms of the Republicans, without splitting Salt Lake City. So I don't anticipate that. We will go over though the representatives for Utah real quick. Do you know much about them, Harrison? Or would you rather me go over them?
I mean, some of them I feel like are kind of backbenchers. I mean, Blake Moore's brand new. He's very young.
Yeah.
He's only 40 years old. He replaced Rob Bishop, who had been there for 2 decades. We all know about Burgess Owens because that seat's a knife fight district where you see frequent turnover. I mean, it's essentially had 4 representatives in the past couple of years, just the past decade even. Yeah. And the other 2 seats, I mean,
John Curtis is pretty.
John Curtis is an interesting Republican because in many ways he's more of a moderate Republican, you might be able to say, or at least very different. I mean, notably, John Curtis's son is actually gay. So John Curtis is 100% open to LGBT marriage and LGBT rights in general. And that's something that sets him apart from some other Republicans out west, even though Utah, again, is kind of like an anomaly. And I always mix these seats up, but he won the special election to replace Jason Chaffetz, who resigned from the seat and is now in the private industry as a media contractor and political consultant.
Yep, and he did so by a large margin.
Yeah, then the other Republican is named Chris Stewart, I think. I don't know very much about him.
Yeah. The only other thing I would say is that one is that Blake Moore lives in Salt Lake City. He doesn't actually live in the first district. None of Salt Lake City is in the first district. The other is that Utah is a very Mormon state. It's the only state in the country with a majority Mormon population, and all of its congressmen are members of the LDS Church. So it's pretty interesting in that regard. Although they're not the only Mormon members of Congress, there are Mormon members from, I believe, from Idaho, from Arizona.
I mean, Matt Salmon was from Arizona. He was a Mormon. I mean, Idaho is the second largest state when it comes to Mormon population, but Arizona has a significant Mormon population as well. You find them in Nevada too, pretty much all around. If you drew a circle around greater Utah, Utah is just a hub for Mormonism, but it's not exclusively where the Mormons are.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, of course, that Burgess Owens is a former football player. He is a convert to the religion or to the denomination, whatever you'd prefer to call it. He grew up Baptist and switched, and then later moved to Utah. And so he is not a native to the state of Utah, as far as I know. Although he does live in Harriman and is definitely he definitely is a resident of the state and of the district he lives in.
It's interesting too because Mia Love also. I mean, she was born in New York City, and she's originally Haitian American. So I don't know. Again, with her, if she was originally part of the Mormon faith or not. Not
Yeah.
100% sure because she grew up in Connecticut.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really an interesting. I mean, not right. It's Utah's the closest is the only state in the country where a religious minority is the majority in the state. And by religious minority, I mean not Protestant and not Catholic, which are the two predominant religions in the United States, or the denominations. Again, I use the term religion and denomination here interchangeably because there's not a Jewish majority state or a Muslim or Buddhist majority state, although there are large numbers of those religions in other states. So it's an interesting outlier in a lot of ways, and it does inform the political culture to some degree. It's worth noting, for example, that Utah has fairly they've reached a compromise between the Mormon LDS Church, whatever you prefer to call it, whatever they prefer to call it, and LGBT activists over a housing discrimination law. So very, very interesting. Again, I would suggest research, on your own time, researching the background of Utah because it is a very interesting state and it's very much an outlier in the Republican Party and nationally in a lot of ways, I would say. But there's two possibilities here that really could happen. I have two maps. I'll start with the Republican gerrymander. Basically, the current map of Utah is extremely inefficient in terms of what it does and the areas it takes in. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So what I did was I decided to draw a map which would make more sense, and the seats would all be roughly in line with how the state of Utah votes as a whole. So all of the districts voted for Donald Trump for president by about an 18 to 21 point margin, so close to the statewide total. I would not expect any more knife fight races during this map, although trends in Salt Lake County could indeed cause something like that. So start with the 4th district, which was drawn for the 4th district representative, which would be Burgess Owens. He lives in, or actually, no, sorry, these totals will move around. So the district names are different, but so the 4th would actually, Burgess Owens would be in this new 1st district right here. I didn't have the districts numbered correctly, but his district, oh no, sorry, not even the 1st. He'll be in the 2nd. So the 2nd has all of Salt Lake City, and it has all of the city right here, which is South Salt Lake, and a couple other areas to the north, and then it draws in almost all the rural areas in the state. And so this votes for Donald Trump by a 19-point margin and votes for him by also 19 points in 2016. So very, very Republican district. Burgess Owens would be quite safe here, I would think. It would be hard to see a 19-point Trump district flipping. Certainly much harder than seeing a 10-point, 9-point Trump district flipping. The new 1st district would be, I believe Chris Stewart is from Farmington, which would be in the 3rd district, I believe. Farmington actually would be. Sorry, I'm trying to look through these. I made this map a while back, so I'm trying to find where the residents are. Farmington. So I'll just go through this in order. So from here, so District 1 is very similar to the current one, but you notice the difference here is it's actually Trump plus 23 points. So it's actually very Republican. The reason it is it does take in these areas of West Valley City, and the cities are all kept intact. There's no city splits in my map. So even though it is kind of gross looking, it does keep the cities intact. The reason this takes in places like Lehigh, Pleasant Grove, Alpine, which are in Provo, which are in Utah County. Utah County is the most Republican urban county in the country. It is extraordinarily Republican. This is a county that has places like Provo. It's very heavily populated, 516,000 people. So pretty urban. In terms of it, it has that corridor that kind of stretches up into Colorado and Wyoming. And it voted in 2012 for Mitt Romney by an astonishing 88 to 10 margin. By far the most Republican urban county in the country. Even in 2008, it voted 77 to 19. These are margins you see in Democratic urban counties. So to see it in a Republican one is astounding. Since then, it's gone back to earth a little bit. In 2016, it voted 80 to 14. For Trump over Clinton, and then Evan McMullin got 36% of the vote. And then 2020, he won at 67 to 26, with another 7% going to third parties. So very, very Republican county. The whole point, broadly speaking, here is it draws in those areas that are very, very Republican, like Lehigh.
A quick point about Utah County, just to show exactly how Republican it really is. So I'm just going to share really quickly. But in 1996, there was a Democratic congressman named Bill Orton, and he was pretty much he was from Provo, which is in Utah County, but he had great appeal outside in the most of these rural counties that had smaller populations. And even in 1996, I mean, he was still doing well out here in a lot of these rural counties. Carbon County is ancestrally Democratic, for example, but ultimately he just got destroyed in Utah County, and it's just gotten more Republican. So it's an urban county for sure, but it's certainly not the typical suburban county that you'd find in the modern
Yeah,
era.
for sure. And it's a very, again, Utah is a very fascinating state. It's one of my favorite states to look about because it's such a unique state. It has a unique political culture and a unique personal culture as well. So the second district obviously mentioned Burgess Owens. This draws in all of the rural areas in the state, plus Salt Lake City. So it's the rural areas of Utah are extraordinarily Republican, aside with the exception of three counties, which are let me turn the labels on here. Grand County, which has a substantial Native American population. San Juan, which also has a substantial, or actually Grand is a has a lot of like ski areas. It's a fairly white county, but it's very similar to a lot of other ski counties where it's very, very Democratic or mostly Democratic at this point. San Juan has a Native American majority and is marginally Republican. And then there's also Summit County, which has portions of around Salt Lake area as well as some ski areas. And it's the most Democratic county in the state, in fact. Trump only lost Salt Lake County by 11 points. He lost Summit by 19. That gives you an idea of what we're talking about here in terms of margins. The third district is the one that would have Chris Stewart in this new third district. He's from Farmington, which is in another county, which is interesting, Davis County, very Republican county, not as much as Provo, but historically quite Republican. In fact, Farmington, Ogden, these areas are becoming a little bit more competitive in terms of they're not 70-point landslides at this point. This seat would have gone to President Trump by about 18 points. Again, it draws in some of these other areas surrounding here. So not Salt Lake City, but Democratic cities at this point, like Murray, like Holiday, and it draws them in without splitting anything. So this would be, I think this would be the most competitive seat in the state in terms of votes. And then this would be the new fourth. This would be probably where Blake Moore would be because I mean, they're not going to split Salt Lake City, I don't think, to put his residence in. This one would have voted for Trump by about 19 points because it has all of Summit. It has some Republican portions or more competitive portions of Salt Lake County, as well as places like Logan and a few other rural counties, along with Provo. Having Provo would make it substantially more Republican, I think, than a lot of other areas in the state. So that's the Republican gerrymander. The results would be a map where Republicans would have won all of them by over 20 points, with the exception of the third district, which would be the most competitive and would be not where you expect a traditional Democratic candidate to compete in. Now, the alternative to this would be a fair map, which would be different in a lot of ways. And so I drew this. It's very simple to draw Utah. So the fourth district here I drew to be as rural as possible. It basically draws in all of some very, very Republican rural areas in the state of Utah. So it has, for example, St. George. It has all of these areas along with Summit County, San Juan, and Grand County. So it has all of the rural areas in the state. This would have voted for, in 2016, voted for Senator Republicans by over 60 points. Now it would have voted for Trump by 71 to 24 margin, so not competitive. The third is Provo, along with some other cities in Salt Lake County. Basically, so it's just part of Utah County, and then these areas of Salt Lake County. This is a Trump plus 27 district, so again, not competitive. Evan McMullen does still outrun Hillary Clinton in this district. He did very, very well in Utah County. In fact, I think he actually won a precinct or two in Utah County. The second is the Democratic seat, which is based around Salt Lake City, has all of the Democratic areas, West Valley City, and it would elect a Democrat, and probably a pretty liberal Democrat at that. Not a Ben McAdams, but a fairly solidly progressive Democrat. This would have voted for Hillary Clinton by 21 points, and it would have voted for Joe Biden by a 61 to 35 margin. Worth noting, though, it wouldn't have been historically as Democratic. Mike Lee only loses this district by a point in 2016. Mitt Romney only loses it by 9. And in the gubernatorial race this time, the Republican governor in Utah only loses it by 10. So historically, a seat that would have been very possible for Republicans to win, but not anymore. And then finally, the first is another safe Republican seat. It draws in the northern areas of this valley region, which you can notice kind of stretches up into Idaho and then down into into parts of Arizona, but it's really just Idaho and Utah in particular that have this pretty solid, you know, valley of support, and it votes for Republicans by again like a 29-point margin. So that's Utah. Those are the two possibilities of really what it could go with. You know, whatever this new fourth district is would set up a primary between Chris Smith and Burgess Owens, and it would be a very interesting primary. I'm not sure who would actually win that primary, so that's something to keep an eye on in terms of where things are going. Is that seat, and this does ultimately matter because if Utah does get a Democratic seat, that's a seat Republicans lose, which helps Democrats in their race to hold the House of Representatives, not lose it. But with that out of the way, that is the state of Utah. Very interesting state. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them and we'll answer them later on. But we'll go ahead and move on to a more interesting state in some ways, which is Virginia. One of the most rapidly Democratic trending counties in the states in the country. It has a competitive gubernatorial race this cycle. It still has some Republican strength down ballot, and we'll have competitive districts. And thanks to a new independent commission, it's going to be an interesting state to follow. So I'll go ahead and throw it to Harrison to explain kind of the recent history of Virginia, some of its representatives, and where we're going before I go ahead and show our fair map, which is what I had devised and had gotten a lot of positive attention from people that I know from Virginia.
Sure. Let me just pull up the congressional districts real quick. All right. So the first thing I want to mention about Virginia is it's one of 4 states in the last half decade where we've seen a court-mandated redraw of the congressional districts since they were first drawn in 2012. The other 3 being North Carolina and Florida, both of which had their maps redrawn ahead of the 2016 cycle. So did Virginia. And Pennsylvania, which had its maps redrawn ahead of the 2018 cycle. And North Carolina, I think, had the maps redrawn again, right, before 2020. So that's
we had them
3 times in
the 2020 election.
Yeah, so North Carolina is crazy. Sorry, Eric.
It's litigation hell.
Yeah, but to look at the current representatives, we'll go through them. So Rob Whitman represents the first congressional district. Its tip essentially stretches up, if you want to look here, the tip essentially stretches up into the parts of Nova. But it mostly is a coastal. But it's mostly just a coastal district. It does take in Fredericksburg, but again, it's held by Rob Whitman, a Republican. This seat has actually become a little bit more marginal as of late, although it's still a Republican seat. If you want to look at the most recent congressional election here,
voted for Trump by 4 points, and only voted for Corey Stewart by 1.
Yeah, it's certainly a little bit more competitive than it has been in the past. You can see Democrats in 2018 had their best performance. They got almost 45% of the vote. Even in 2020, they managed to hold it above 40%, which was pretty uncommon in that district at the time. Keep in mind that these are old boundaries when you go further back. These boundaries have only been in place since 2016. This second one here is held by Elaine Luria, a Democrat. She represents the Norfolk area over here. And it's notable to look at this coastal Virginia seat because it was formerly held by a Republican named Scott Taylor in 2018. And Scott Taylor started in 2016. He beat Randy Forbes, who was the incumbent Republican in a primary, and he was the challenger. And Forbes lost that primary. It was the second Republican incumbent primary loss in 2 cycles, the first being Dave Bratt beating Eric Cantor in the 2014 cycle. But under these new lines, he won that primary, won his term in 2016, narrowly lost the seat to Luria in 2018. If you want to look down here, where is it? Yeah, just so I can show you a bit of the elections. And Scott Taylor tried to make a comeback bid in 2020. It just did not work. The Virginia Beach area has really seen a general trend toward the Democrats, though, which is quite interesting. And it really started off, even though Ralph Northam is from this area, we started hearing it on election night 2017 with just how well Ralph Northam was doing there in comparison to Terry McAuliffe in the previous gubernatorial election against Ken Cuccinelli. And that's something to keep in mind. The third district is held by Bobby Scott from Newport News, and the third district is one of, I guess you could say, the VRA seats. It's plurality black. And the third and fourth districts are both represented by black incumbents, the other being Donald
Yeah.
McEachin in the 4th District from Richmond. And this seat is not a VRA seat, it is majority white, but this took in a lot of Randy Forbes' former territory and made it a much more Democratic seat. So the Democrats picked that seat up in 2016.
And I do have a comment here about those are the two seats that were redrawn, the 3rd and the 4th. If I can go ahead and show my screen here, that will show our viewers what was actually changed with the Virginia map. So this is what the previous map looked like. You'll notice here basically the 3rd district used to have Richmond, and it used to have Norfolk and some other areas around here. It was kind of a really bizarre looking seat, but it was drawn to have a majority black population. And then the 4th district was this Republican seat taking in parts of Chesterfield County, and then parts of maybe part of Henrico County, but it was a Republican seat held by Randy Forbes. And then so basically looked very different. And then that was redrawn as a racial gerrymander because it packed all of the Democratic voters into this 3rd district right here. Never mind, that's how it used to look previously. This is how it had looked for quite a while. Was that unusual split along the Virginia Beach area? So now the map
and that's why
to,
unpacking essentially doomed Randy Forbes to losing his primary to Scott Taylor in the 2nd district and gave Donald McEachin a much, you could say, a better opportunity to win. Much of that 4th district territory turned into a Democratic seat. Not as Democratic as the 3rd, but still a Clinton and Biden seat.
But it's worth noting, those are the districts that were changed. The rest of the state, the rest of its districts stayed intact as far as I can tell. They didn't have any other changes beyond just fixing the areas directly surrounding the Richmond area.
Yep, and if you want to add my screen back, I just also wanted to briefly, I forgot to mention in the 2nd district, it was briefly represented by a Democrat named Glenn Nye. In its previous form, it was a seat that Democrats came close or at least were competitive in 2004 and 2006. So eventually in 2008, after a close fight in 2006, the DCCC invested a lot in Glenn Nye beating Thelma Drake. And they did win that seat. Ultimately, though, he was defeated for re-election in 2010. Reminds me a lot of Frank Cradaville on Maryland's eastern coast, who beat Andy Harris. Andy Harris beat a moderate congressman named Wayne Gilchrist, a Republican. We'll be interviewing him on Blast from the Past next month, actually. But Gilchrist lost the primary, and Andy Harris lost in 2008 narrowly to Cradaville. But he came back a lot like E. Scott Rigel in 2010 and beat Cradaville by pretty much the exact same margin. And ironically, it's a bit off topic, but now Andy Harris might be finding himself drawn out. But we'll move on to the 5th district. The 5th district was also held by by a Democrat named Tom Perriello. You may remember him from his 2017 gubernatorial bid. And he won in 2008 as well, but lost in 2010. The seat is now held by Bob Good. And there was a lot of strife in this seat. You had a Republican named Denver Riggleman before who was criticized by party officials for officiating a gay wedding, which is obviously a small crime in the eyes of most people. But they held a state convention, and ultimately in the state convention vote, Riggleman lost the primary, quote unquote, to Bob Good, the far more conservative candidate. And Bob Good proceeded to beat Cameron Webb in 2020 by a pretty decent margin. And I won't say Cameron Webb was a bad candidate. It was just one of many Democratic House candidates that, frankly, were overestimated, including by myself. But
it's worth noting with Tom Perriello, people know him now as a progressive. Back when he was a representative in the House, he was actually quite conservative. He represented his district more, and then he challenged Ralph Northam in 2017 in the Democratic primary as a pretty dyed-in-the-wool progressive candidate.
Yeah. Ben Klein, that's the former Bob Goodlatte seat on the West Virginia border. If you remember, Bob Goodlatte was a pretty influential House Republican. Abigail Spanberger is the 7th district. So a little bit of history on this seat. Traditionally, very, very reliably Republican. It was held by Eric Cantor, and Eric Cantor was actually House Majority Leader. But Cantor lost his primary in 2014 to Dave Bratt by about 10 points. And Dave Bratt was running as an outsider. He was an economics professor, one of the two at Liberty University. So he's definitely the outsider candidate. Eric Cantor's political ambitions were just so crushed by that he resigned the seat in the House. So Dave Bratt ended up winning that year. in 2014, filling the vacant seat. And Dave Bratt was pretty much considered a safe bet until 2018. Abigail Spanberger came along, a lot like 2006. In 2006, a lot of the more prominent Democratic candidates, office holders, people that the DCCC would try and convince to run for office, they were discouraged from running because they saw these seats as having voted Republican pretty reliably in the previous election cycles. So, same thing happened with Rahm Emanuel when he was running the DCCC in 2006. A lot of good candidates that had experience had seen just the terrible Democratic performances and high incumbent reelection rates of the previous two cycles and opted not to run. So somebody like Spanberger was an outsider candidate. Most of the winning Democratic candidates in 2006 and 2018 who beat Republican incumbents were outsiders who won in a blue wave and defeated incumbents who had fallen asleep at the wheel. And Dave Bratt was one of those individuals to a lesser extent. And Spanberger was an outsider. She had worked for the CIA, came in and managed to win. And it wasn't razor thin close. It was still a close race, but she won by about 2 points. Her race was actually closer this time around in 2020. She almost lost to a Republican named Nick Freitas. And honestly, to some extent, this race was closer than we expected. Mm-hmm. So Abigail Spanberger after that became quite prominent in the media because reportedly on a call with other Democrats, she was criticizing the Democratic campaign strategy and was worried that the progressive faction of the party's House caucus would tarnish moderate members like her in competitive seats as socialists and essentially ruin their electoral strategies and trick voters into backing Republicans. So she was very vocal about making sure they didn't essentially adopting too progressive of an agenda and a campaign message would hurt moderate Democrats in seats that are marginally Democratic or Republican.
And it's worth noting that she was in particular very offended by the defund the police attacks. Those apparently were very effective against her. This is a seat that went from Trump +6 to Biden +1, so it's still very competitive. It's not she still outran Biden as far as I can tell by a very small margin, but she was very, very upset about the defund the police stuff because it made her race a lot more challenging than she thought it would be.
Yeah, and Nick Freitas was not a good candidate. I'm just going to come out and say that. He literally failed to properly file his petitions originally. Definitely not a top recruit, which is why it scared her, because typically you only see bad candidates win in wave years when you're just swept in by your party's momentum. So to have a mediocre candidate come close to beating you as a good incumbent, I mean, she was a good incumbent in terms of establishing herself as a fundraiser and a campaigner. That's kind of threatening. The 8th is represented by Don Beyer. He ran for governor against Jim Gilmore in 1997, 98, one of those years, 97. And Gilmore famously is just remembered as an awful governor by both sides, particularly for mishandling the state's budget. And just for trivia, his handling of the state government is pretty much why he got annihilated by Mark Warner in his run for the open Senate seat in 2008. And Warner was the governor at the time. The 9th is represented by Morgan Griffith. He's been in the seat since 2010. He actually won in an upset in 2010. The incumbent was a Democrat named Rick Boucher, who'd pretty much held the 9th district, which had historically been a knife fight district, a lot like Utah's 4th, really, historically. Now it's safe Republican, but Boucher was expected to hold on to the seat narrowly. Griffith actually defied the polls and won, and he's been reelected safely since then. The 10th is represented by Jennifer Wexton. 20 years ago, Nova, essentially, Loudoun and Fairfax County, solidly Republican. A lot like the collar counties in Illinois or the collar in Philadelphia, like any traditional, even the collar around Atlanta, the Cobb, Gwinnett type setup, just brutal for Democrats. Barbara Comstock lost re-election to her in 2018. She actually had the closest race of her career, Comstock, in 2016 up to that point. And ultimately now it's just very, very difficult for Republicans to win in Nova. I mean, you can shave off Democratic margins, but winning is pretty much out of the question. Jerry is in the 11th district, just to wrap up. He actually did have a close race against, it was either Trevor Simeon, some guy named Simeon, a Republican in 2010. That was his only close race. It was very tight. But other than that, this is a safe Democratic seat, the most Democratic, second most Democratic in the state.
Yeah. For those who are wondering about like how Democratic Fairfax County has gotten, in particular, it's the most striking one. This is a county that voted for Bob McDonnell in the 2009 gubernatorial election by about 2 points, so voted for Republican. By the 2017 race, it had gone to a 68-31 Democratic count. And that's even pretty low compared to how it actually votes federally. And then you look at places like Loudoun County and Prince William County, which have become almost equally as Democratic. It's really been a raw area for Republicans, to put it lightly. And there have been many, many heartbreaks for Republicans in Virginia because the rest of the state tends to report first. And then Northern Virginia comes in and produces a Democratic victory.
Yeah, but if you want to, Eric, feel free to go ahead and show your map in Virginia.
Yeah. So we're not using the Redistricting Radar map. We're actually using a map I developed, which was universally beloved, and I don't say that lightly, by the Virginia group of people we have here at Elections Daily. Seem to really, really love this map in particular. It is, on first glance, it's a very fair map, and I think it would be something the commission might be prone to produce something like. There's certain no-goes that I think the commission won't go for. For example, I've heard that a lot of people in Charlottesville and Charleston County, or Charlottesville and the southern Richmond suburbs don't want to be in the same district together. That's a common draw for people who are casual map makers because they're both Democratic areas now. But they don't really like being in the same district together. They're different regions of the state. So my map does something very different in how it draws them. So I'm going to go ahead and show my map. I'm going to go district by district. So I'm going to highlight what I've done here. And it does make some changes to the current status quo. This is not drawn with incumbency as a factor. So this is the new first district. It takes in everywhere from Fredericksburg area all the way along the coast, the northern Richmond suburbs, past Henrico County, has Jamestown, and it has the Eastern Shore. This is something I've heard frequently from Virginia people, is the Eastern Shore is not really a great fit for the second district. It's a very rural area. While it is connected by bridge to the Virginia Beach area, this seems to be more so for transit to and from the D.C., Baltimore area and other areas around in Maryland than it is for travel to the Eastern Shore, which is still, as of right now, you can see it right here when I highlight them, 44,000 people. It doesn't have a lot of people, and it kind of just fits better into this first district. This new second district is a new draw. It's a new design. It takes in Virginia Beach. It takes in Chesapeake. And it also takes in the entire city of Norfolk. Now, the reason this is drawn like this is, one, I think it's a reasonable way to do things. The second is doing it the other way, where you split off some of these areas, really advantages Republicans more than they probably warrant. This version of, or actually, sorry, I'll go back and explain how these places vote, but I'm going to just highlight how they voted here first. So the first district is a Trump plus 17 district in 2016. Voted for Corey Stewart by about 7 points and for Ed Gillespie by about 14. So this would be a solid Republican seat, more so than the current one. The second would have voted for Joe Biden by about 5 points, would have voted for Ralph Northam by about 12 points, and Tim Kaine by about 17 points. This is still a feasibly competitive district down ballot. I mean, probably wouldn't have been more than Biden plus 8 or so, I don't think. But it would be a Democratic leaning seat. This new third as well keeps the VRA status intact. You'll notice it draws in these African American areas of Chesapeake. This is another reason I like this map. You'll notice it draws in, it doesn't draw by race, but it draws in these independent cities pretty well. And it connects by bridge as well through Newport News and through this county right here. And it votes for Democrats by about 20 points. It's a majority white seat, but a black Democrat would win here. This new fourth district as well is not majority black, neither is the current one, but it is a majority non-white seat, and it again would vote for Democrats by a very large margin of about 27 points. This new fifth district is a Republican-leaning seat. Abigail Spanberger would be in trouble here. It draws in these Piedmont regions of Virginia, which actually make a lot more sense as a grouping than drawing along to Charlottesville. So this seat would have gone to Corey Stewart by 5 points, still feasibly competitive. You'll notice here the Democratic parts of Chesterfield County do get to go into the fourth district, so reasonably happy in that regard. Also, the notorious Colonial Heights is included in the fourth district. A commission might do this the other way, but I just don't like Colonial Heights, and so I put it into the fourth district. For those who aren't familiar, Colonial Heights is often pejoratively called Colonial Whites. It was literally created by splitting a city in two so that the white portion would have its own city. It has a reputation as a not ideal place. It's very Republican. Some of Amanda Chase. I don't like it. It's in the fourth district for that reason. That's an objectively spiteful move. It doesn't really matter that much in terms of population. Now, I really like this new 6th district. So the 6th goes from Charlottesville, contains Lynchburg, it contains Roanoke, and it contains Staunton as well. I love the 6th district, and people who know Virginia like this as well. It's basically these urban communities in the Shenandoah Valley. And you'll notice here, this actually does vote for Tim Kaine in the Senate race. It's relatively close. So it's a competitive district. Someone like a Bob Bad or Bob Good, we call him jokingly Bob Bad. Bob Good would probably be Bob Bad.
I have to shout out my good friend Armin he created that.
Yes. So Bob Good would probably be Bob Bad here because he would not be popular in the more progressive communities around Roanoke, Charlottesville, and probably not in Lynchburg either, to be honest. So this is a Republican-leaning seat, but it could be competitive in the right circumstances. This new 7th is an interesting one. Republicans would actually really like this seat because it gives them some representation in Northern Virginia. This has parts of Prince William County. It has part of Loudoun County. It also has places like Harrisonburg and Winchester. And this would be a Republican seat. It would have voted for Corey Stewart by 11 points, for Donald Trump by 19. But Republicans would be very happy with this in Northern Virginia because they'd finally be able to retain their job as a consultant in D.C. while also living in possibly one of 2 Republican areas of Northern Virginia. You'll notice here this has the rural portion of Loudoun County, as well as these areas around Manassas and southern Prince William County. The 8th district here is another district. It's based in Northern Virginia. It's not really worth mentioning. It has Alexandria, Groveton. These don't split city lines as well. These DC seats, which is I'm very happy about. The 9th district is down in the mountains. It would be very Republican. Would have voted for Corey Stewart by 30 points. Voted for Ed Gillespie by 38. Trump by 42 points. Overwhelmingly Republican. This 10th district is part of Loudoun and part of Fairfax County. Notice again, no city splits, and it's very Democratic, a Democrat plus 30 district. And then finally, the 11th is another Democrat plus 30 district. It is also the most non-white of these districts. It's only 54% white, very racially diverse. Down ballot, you'll notice large Hispanic, Black, and Asian populations. So how this map votes overall, and I'll turn off the only current here. This map would, on balance, vote for Democrats 6-5. The median seat would be the 2nd congressional district here. Democrats would have won these 3 districts in Northern Virginia and these 3 districts in Richmond and Hampton Roads. And there'd be also 5 other districts that Republicans would be favored in. And Democrats would have won in 2018, would have won 7 districts, which is quite reasonable given their popular vote margin. I don't know how this votes in the 2020 election. We haven't calculated it, but I don't anticipate any of these districts flipping. The 3rd is the only one. It maybe goes to Biden plus 8 or plus 10. The rest of these would still be about the same, though, I would think, aside from maybe this new 6th district. But that's my Virginia map. I'm really, really happy with this. I'm going to lobby hard for it to be in our update of Redistricting Radar when we get the new census data. But I am very, very happy with how this goes. And the Virginia people I know are also as well. I don't tout this without people like Joanna and other people that we have on our Virginia team who you saw some of them in the Virginia panel we had, the discussion of the primary. All of them were very, very pleased with this map. So I think this is something fairly reasonable that the commission could do. We don't know if they're going to draw an incumbent map or truly be independent or maybe have a Republican skew. We really don't know. But most assuredly, though, it will not be an extreme gerrymander on either side, I don't think. It's going to be a reasonably fair map, and an amalgamation of a fair map, at least. So now we'll move on to our next state, which is the state of Washington. This is an interesting state because it's got a lot of nominally competitive districts. It has a commission structure. It's generally anticipated that some of the seats will be less competitive now than they were when they started. But overall, this is seen as a Democratic-leaning state with a lot of red areas and a few areas that are actually trending on the whole to Republicans, however limited that trend may be. So we'll go ahead and get started on Washington, which I'll cover since Harrison just covered Virginia. I'll cover Washington. So Washington State has 10 congressional districts. It has a 7-3 Democratic majority. Republicans hold the 3rd, 4th, and 5th districts, while Democrats hold everything else. So everything that touches Seattle or the Seattle area is Democratic, and everything that does not touch the Seattle area is Republican. Although the exception here, of course, is the 10th, which has portions of Tacoma, I believe. Um, and so we'll go through these members. You'll notice a lot of these are kind of backbenchers, and it's just there's a lot of generic Democrats here. Susan Delbene from Medina, Rick Larson in the second district. The Republicans are more interesting, so I'll go through the Democrats first. Derek Kilmer in the sixth. Kilmer is actually an interesting fellow. His district is trending Republican, you'll notice, somewhat. It voted for Obama by 15 points, and then it voted for Clinton by 12, and then for Biden by 18. So it trended back a little bit. It snapped back, but a lot of the areas around this area are trending more Republican, and there's also a large white working class base. So Kilmer has a reputation as kind of a technocrat, very notable, very influential figure in the Hill. Prema Jayapal is a progressive out of Seattle. You probably heard of her. She's very, very part of a progressive caucus. Kim Schreier in the 8th is a traditionally Republican district. This district was represented until very recently by Republican Dave Reicher, who is from King County. This district has portions of King County. He retired in 2018 and was replaced by Democrat Kim Schreier. Now, this seat has voted Democrat for president in 2008, 12, 16, and 20. So it's not a newly trending Democratic seat, but rather it's just one that the time has kind of picked up on. It went from Obama +2 to Clinton +3 to Biden +7. So still nominally competitive, but it's worth noting that the district actually had competitive races in 2018. Notoriously unlucky Republican Dino Rossi, very credible candidate who's done very well, lost the seat by about 5 points, which is about.
And if I could tell you, I just need to tell our viewers a little bit about how historically unlucky he really was.
Yeah, but we'll do that real quick just after I mention the other race, which is recently for Schreier, which is against Jesse Jensen this time. She actually performed terribly in the blanket primary, and this was kind of a sign that the seat was competitive in November. Kraz Granitz wrote an excellent article covering it and talked with her Republican opponent, Jesse Jensen, who only lost the seat by 3 points. That's actually a very respectable performance for a Republican in the 8th district.
But just real quick before I'll let Eric get back to it, just not only was Dino Rossi unlucky in that 2018 race, as you're about to see, he was also terribly unlucky in the 2004 gubernatorial election, which he lost literally by a few hundred votes. And the litigation on this race was drawn out pretty much just as long as Al Franken's narrow, controversial 100-so vote victory over Norm Coleman in 2008. Mm-hmm. He was very unlucky. He was under 200 votes away from becoming the governor of Washington, essentially, which would have drastically changed his career.
And it's even more historically because he's run 4 competitive races and he's lost all of them. He ran in 2008. In a horrible year for Washington Republicans. He was one good spot. He fairly ran close against the governor he had narrowly lost to in 2004. Then in 2010, he ran for Senate. Again, he did very respectably in Washington. He did very, very well.
I think Miles actually noted the other day that he's really the only reason that race was even competitive in 2010, even in a bad environment.
He only lost by 4.5 points in Washington in a Senate race against Patty Murray. And then he loses the 2018 House race. People make fun of him as a perennial candidate and a joke candidate. Perennial candidate, yes. Joke candidate, no. It's just Washington's a really tough state for a Republican to win in. He's
just been an unlucky, serious candidate, if you want to.
Yeah. Again, I don't call him a joke, and I think you shouldn't call him either. He has a pretty impressive electoral resume in Washington, which is not a state that is favorable to Republicans. He's gotten closer to winning statewide and in competitive districts than pretty much any other Republican in the state of Washington has. So the fact that he ran pretty close in 2018 isn't that surprising. I mean, 5-point margin in Washington 8 is not terrible. He's actually a pretty credible, qualified candidate. He just has a bum luck of running in a really, really problematic state for Republicans. But back to the rest of the Democrats here in the state. Adam Smith is another Democrat. He's from the 9th district, which has parts of Bellevue in it. It's a majority non-white seat, actually, at this point, very marginally so. He's more moderate than the seat would suggest. He's still a liberal, mostly, but he's not as progressive as you would expect from a seat that is that high of a PVI. And then finally, the 10th is newly elected Representative Marilyn Strickland. You'll notice that this district was, even though it's nominally somewhat competitive, Biden plus 16, Clinton plus 12. She actually, because of the blanket primary system, she actually made the top two with another Democrat, and she won against a more progressive Democrat by
And
about 14.
she was actually one of the first three, together with Young Kim and Michelle Park Steele, the first three Korean American women elected to Congress. So that's another little historic note for her.
Yeah. She won by 14. You'll notice here they include write ins because although some Republicans did vote in the race, a lot of them did just keep their ballots blank or they wrote in someone else. This tends to happen in jungle primary states. That's why I hate jungle primaries. But the three Republicans here are all really, really fascinating. Washington Republicans punch above their weight. Jamie Herrera Butler is one of the Hispanic women in Congress. At the time, she was one of the few women in Congress on the Republican side. This is a nominally competitive district around the Portland area, the northern Portland suburbs. You notice Trump only won the seat by 4 points. So not a thoroughly Democratic seat, or Republican seat, I should say. But Butler is very popular. She won the seat by 5 points in a very bad year, and then won by 13 points against the same Democrat this time. And then in the 4th district, Dan Newhouse is from this very Republican seat in the center of the state. This is a Republican seat where you often see Republican versus Republican in a lot of ways. And then Kathy McMorris Rodgers is the former chair of a former very high-ranking Republican. She's one of the most influential Republicans in Congress and very much punches above her weight. Democrats wanted to take her out in 2018, and they got within 10 in her Spokane-based seat, which is a Biden plus or Trump plus 9 seat. Former seat of Representative Tom Foley, one of the few Democrats to lose, one of the few House speakers to lose their seat.
Since 1862 when he lost.
He lost a seat in the 94 red wave, and it's been Republican ever since.
That was a massive upset. And to be fair, George Nethercutt, who beat him, did run for Senate in 2004, but did not come close, which again shows that Dina Rossi was a good candidate.
Yeah. But these three are very important. And so McMorris Rodgers, because she is a very, very influential Republican on the Hill. And then these two, because they voted to impeach President Trump. We actually have these guys fairly low on the primary list, in part because it's a top two system. It's very likely that it's hard to get rid of an incumbent in a top two system. And honestly, they're both pretty popular. I mean, you could see an R versus R race in the 4th, but all that would do is the Democrats in that race, assuming Newhouse makes the top two, which is fairly likely, I would think, would probably vote for him over any Trump-based challenger. Same with McMorris Rodgers. It's also quite possible that it's the highest performing R versus the highest performing D.
It was Newhouse voted for impeachment, but Butler voted for impeachment too.
Yes, they both voted for impeachment. So they're on the list of people that want primary challenges, but on the other hand, they're not the top of the list. I think they're both going to be probably fine. It depends on how their seats are drawn, I think, but I think they'll both be fine. I don't think out of the two, I think Newhouse is the more probable to lose because he is in a worse seat for that sort of electoral person. But at the same time, I don't think either of them are top tier Democratic targets or anything.
No, I mean, someone like, for example, Adam Kinzinger is certainly much more risk, or just Liz Cheney herself.
Yeah, they're in much redder seats. Yeah, and so then now we get to
Gonzalez and Davis.
Yeah, and so we'll get to the map I drew, which is a fair map of Washington. It's based off of our Redistricting Radar map. It's basically the same map as the Redistricting Radar map. They don't have 2020 data yet for the state of Washington, but they do have 2016 data, which is fairly useful in a lot of ways. In particular for the gubernatorial races, because Washington, even though Republicans haven't won the gubernatorial race here in a very long time, it is a state where the races tend to be competitive. In fact, Republicans almost flipped the office in 2012. They had a very credible candidate. And so they tend to do much better down ballot in some of these areas. So we'll go district by district. I don't know if this will be the way it's drawn. I think most people expect the 8th to take in more of King County and this become more Democratic. But I think the idea, it becomes so Democratic that it's out of reach, becomes a bit of a challenge, I think, as far as seats go. So this new 1st district takes in these two very rural, or these two Island and San Juan counties, which are very Democratic areas. In particular, San Juan is just absurdly Democratic. This seat would have voted for Trump or for Biden by 7 points, would have narrowly voted for Jay Inslee, and would have narrowly voted for the Democratic senator in 2018. So this is a theoretically competitive seat, But the fact that it has San Juan and Island makes it a lot more Democratic and much more likely to hold for Democrats. The second tier takes in these cities along the Seattle northern suburbs. It's much more Democratic. Democrats win the seat easily by large margins, although, again, you'll notice the gubernatorial race, it's within 20, so much more competitive in that race. The third district is, again, very similar, Trump plus 8, R plus 10 in the governor race, and then R plus 3 in the 4 in the Senate race in 2018. So, again, theoretically competitive. It takes in more of Thurston County around Olympia, which is the state capital. The fourth district is a little bit different. This time it takes in all of Yakima. It takes in Klickitat County. It takes in these areas. Very Republican, R plus 23, very, very safe Republican. Fifth district, again, is the Spokane-based seat. Spokane has Whitman, two college areas. In particular, Spokane's the biggest seat in eastern Washington, biggest city that is. And this is, again, a very safe Republican district for the most part, especially with McMorris Rogers. This 6 is pretty much identical to the current version. It votes for Clinton by 12, votes for Inslee by 7 or 8 points. The new 7th is these southern areas around Seattle. Again, this is the Adam Smith seat, very, very Democratic. Democrat plus 40. This new 8th district does become more Democratic, but not overwhelmingly Democratic. It's only Clinton plus 6.8 or so. It actually goes Republican in the gubernatorial race and is very competitive in the Senate race. So this is still a competitive district, I think. This 9th district is based out of Seattle. You'll notice it has all of Seattle in it. And the other thing that's notable about it is Republicans get 9% of the vote here, and third parties get 5.5% in 2016. So it's actually quite possible that Republicans may get fewer votes than third parties here on occasion, because this is, in fact, all of the city of Seattle. You'll notice all of it is in the district. And then finally, the 10th is based around Tacoma, and it's basically almost entirely in Pierce County. Goes to Democrats by about 13 points. So that's the map. I don't know if they do something like this. It's just a hypothetical fair map. It's quite possible they draw an incumbent protection gerrymander. You could easily, for example, give Kilmer, for example, Aberdeen, or he has Aberdeen, which is famous for a lot of reasons, but give him Pacific County and then swap that out for Klickitat or Yakima to help Herrera Butler. But in reality, I think I don't think it's going to be a gerrymander or anything. I think a 6-3 or a 6-4 or a 7-3 could be very viable in Washington State. It just kind of depends on what we're going for.
Yep. All right. So I think that brings us to Wisconsin. All right, so let me load up the Wisconsin Congressional Districts link so I can share my screen.
Yeah, Wisconsin is going to be a very challenging state for Democrats because it's very, very difficult to draw them any more than 2 congressional districts in a fair map. That's very difficult.
Very weird thing about Wisconsin. Wisconsin is arguably traditionally a Democratic state at the federal level, yet it's incredibly difficult to draw those Democrats into a map that essentially yields a Democratic majority without it being a gerrymander. It's just such a difficult state to draw.
Because, again, most Democrats in Wisconsin, and I'm not making this up, are based in Madison or in Milwaukee. You can't really split either of those cities and call it a fair map. And you can't bleed them out into Republican areas and call it a fair map. So it's going to be really challenging because the governor of the state is a Democrat and is going to want a more Democratic-friendly map. At the same time, it's kind of impossible to do that without violating a lot of redistricting principles. And Republicans control the legislature, so we really don't know what's going to happen.
Where the Democrats are geographically are essentially geographically salient in such a way that it makes it very difficult to draw a map. This is the current map. And if you want to look at this, only 3 of these seats are held by Democrats. One of them is a Trump seat. Really, only 2 of these seats are Democratic seats on paper, although the third is traditionally Democratic. So if we look at them, the first district is home to Brian Stile, and Brian Stile was he took over for Paul Ryan, who notably retired in 2018, ending his speakership just in time for the GOP to lose the House. Stile actually looks a lot like Paul Ryan. It's kind of scary to some extent. He does kind of look like a clone, but he fits in quite well. In fact, many voters, if they saw him, probably would just think that Paul Ryan's continuing to represent them.
Yep, and he's notorious for defeating the Democratic Twitter favorite, Iron Stash, who ran one of the worst House campaigns in recent memory and managed to lose this competitive seat by 10 points in 2018.
And then again, you could say competitive. It still leans Republican. It takes in the southern part of Waukesha County, largely based around Racine and Kenosha County. Also takes in some of all of Walworth County. Actually, is the only county that's not split in there. Mark Pocan is definitely the most progressive member of the delegation, and he represents, if you want to take a look at the district for yourself, Madison. And I think that's where. Isn't that where University of Wisconsin is?
Yeah, it's the state capital as well. It's very, very democratic. I mean, it's absurdly democratic.
Yeah, it is very democratic. Even the surrounding counties outside of the Madison area are also democratic. That's really all you need to know. Ron Kind is a Democrat who's been in office for a long time. This is a seat it was a narrow Trump seat in 2016 and again a Trump seat in 2020. Ron Kind, a lot like Sherry Bustos in Illinois 17th, had the closest race of his career against Derek Van Orden. Van Orden was criticized during the campaign, but ultimately he managed to run a fairly close race. It was definitely the strongest challenge Kind has ever had. And if redistricting doesn't bode well for Kind, which is quite possible, I would have said in the past he might jump into the race for Senate, but with Mandela Barnes in that race, I don't think he's going to be jumping in against Ron Johnson. So he's either going to lose re-election in 2022 or retire.
Yeah, and it's worth noting this was drawn as a Democratic vote sink.
It was, and I mean, I wouldn't compare it to the Colin Peterson seat because that's just so much more Republican. And Ron Kind doesn't necessarily have the history of ticket splitting. He does, but not to the same extent as Colin Peterson did. And the seat, you have to keep in mind, it's not like Colin Peterson's seat, which is Republican plus 31. This is only Republican plus 4, I believe, in 2016. I forgot the 2020 numbers, but Trump did.
Yeah, it was Trump plus 4. It was about Trump plus 4.
It was around Trump plus 4. But nonetheless, this seat will be tough. If this seat itself were just up in its current form in 2022, Kind would have a very tough race and would probably lose if it's a good environment for the Republicans. Glenn Moore represents the 4th district, which takes in Milwaukee. It's a plurality white seat, so it's majority non-white, but it's not majority black by any means. Scott Fitzgerald he's like the definition of backbencher Republican at this point, but he replaced Jim Sensenbrenner, who had been in office for a very long time, well over 40 years in this 5th district seat, safe Republican.
Mr. Republican in Wisconsin.
Glenn Grothman is another backbencher, represents the 6th district. Tom Tiffany represents the 7th district. He won a special election earlier on to replace Sean Duffy, who has 9 kids, and his most recent child was unfortunately born with a heart condition, so he felt he wanted to resign to spend more time with his family. So he did that. And Mike Gallagher.
I want to mention one thing that I found interesting. You may be familiar with about Sean Duffy. He was actually a former reality TV star. He was on the Real World TV show back in the 90s. His wife, as well as his manager Rachel Campos Duffy, was also on the Real World. So they both started as MTV stars. And he later went to Congress, and his wife is now a very successful television commentator, and they have 9 kids. So you could say they're doing pretty well for themselves.
Yep. And the 8th district is home to Mike Gallagher, a rising star within the Wisconsin Republican Party for sure. If potentially he'll stay in the House and keep building his name rec, but if he doesn't run for governor, he could always run for the Senate in the future when Ron Johnson presumably retires from his seat in 2028. But either way, he would be a formidable statewide candidate from Green Bay, and certainly expect to see this face in statewide politics in Wisconsin sometime in the future. Out of all of the, I guess you could say, backbencher Republicans, he's the most promising for a career outside of the House. So that's the map.
Yeah, and again, just a little bit more about what we're talking about here is that the 7th, in particular, the 7th and the 3rd are where Democrats have just cratered. The 7th went from a district that Romney won by 3 points to one that Trump won by an overwhelming margin of 20 percentage points, and then 21 and then 20 percentage points. So absurdly Republican district at this point. Same with the 8th. The 8th, actually, the previous iteration was won by Barack Obama. It has Green Bay in it, but now It's another Romney plus 3 seat. This actually wasn't an extreme Republican gerrymander when it was drawn, but over time it's become a Republican plus 16 seat. So very, very Republican. Um, and so I'll go ahead and show our a fair map, which is basically I have two maps actually, or no, I have one map, which is basically, and I can go into a little bit of as to why it is what it is. Trust me when I say you can't draw in good faith a 4-4 map in Wisconsin that is not a blatant gerrymander in terms of appearance. It's not possible. You can't do it. There's no way. It's just not a reasonable possibility. And the reason why is the Democratic votes are concentrated in Milwaukee and Madison. You could not split those cities, or at least not split them up enough. In particular, Milwaukee has specific VRA concerns. Splitting up the Hispanic community from the Black community could result in retrogression, and it could result in this becoming effectively majority white, which would be not great for the Black community in there, which relies on a coalition with Hispanic voters. In order, that's not to say coalition seats are a thing, but if the seat is drawn in such a way as to split the Hispanics off so they lose representation, and to split the Blacks off so they lose representation, and you get two seats with a white Democrat, that is a textbook violation of the VRA if I've ever seen one. And it's very, very challenging not to avoid that. So our map we developed is an attempt to mitigate these concerns as much as possible while still drawing a compact map. This is just a modification of our redistricting radar map. We think it's reasonable. You may not like it, but it's pretty reasonable in terms of how it votes and what it looks like. So here's how the map starts. The first district has all of Janesville in it now, Rock County, all of Racine, all of Kenosha, and then all of Walworth and Jefferson counties, as well as Watertown across the border in another county right there. This is a seat that Trump wins by about 5 points in both 2016 and 2020. It votes Republican in both the Senate and the governor races. You'll notice a pattern here. This is a problem for Democrats, as a lot of these seats don't vote for Democrats, even when Democrats win. It's competitive, though, which is enough, I think, to make it a reasonable seat. It is worth noting that that in 2018, Tammy Baldwin does win. There's too many Tammys in the Senate. Tammy Baldwin does win the seat, so there is at least that. The second district is Madison-based, very similar to the current one, very Democratic overall. You'll notice how in 2016, it's a seat that Democrats get 65% of the vote in. 2020, this goes up to 70%. That's a big reason why they won Wisconsin. The third district is unfortunately not really competitive for Democrats at this point. It's a Trump plus 7 seat in both 2016 and 2020. Tammy Baldwin does win the district, although Tony Evers does not win the district. So it would be very unlikely Democrats hold this district. The fourth here is most of Milwaukee, along with these two southern cities, along with these other areas. It is majority white by CVAP, but it is enough that whites would not make up a majority of the electorate on the Democratic side. And it does keep these cities intact. There is a little bit of Milwaukee right here. You'll notice this East Village area up on further that does go into the new 5th district, but it's a reasonable split. I think it was either that or one of these smaller cities. We chose to split the bigger city, Milwaukee, rather than splitting a smaller city. This 5th district is a pure suburban seat, has all of crucial Waukesha County in it, goes to Germantown, has a couple of these cities up north, has these northern suburban cities in Wisconsin, as well as or Milwaukee, as well as a little bit of Milwaukee itself, and then a few of these other cities. The result is a seat that goes from Trump plus 10 to Trump plus 3.5, and it does vote, although it does vote very Republican down ballot. Leah Vukmir does win the seat in 2018, and Scott Walker wins the seat by 16 points. So it's still very Republican overall. Down ballot. We would expect a Republican to hold it, although it would be a very competitive seat overall. The new 6th district stretches from Sheboygan and Manitowoc all the way into Wisconsin, into the core of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, Wisconsin Rapids. This is a Trump plus 23 seat. This is a kind of a leftover seat in the center of the state. It's a very, very Republican seat, to put it lightly. This new 7th district stretches from the Iron Range all the way down, has Wausau, has a few other areas. This is, again, still very Republican. It actually trends right from 2016 to 2020. It goes from about Trump plus 22.4 to Trump plus 22.5 or 6 or 7. And even Tammy Baldwin does not win it. And Tony Evers doesn't really claw back either. And then the seat, this is another seat I really like. This is Green Bay, stretches along Green Bay into Appleton and Oshkosh. So it's basically three competitive cities that are quite reasonable. It's drawn very reasonably. This is a competitive seat on paper, although again, Mike Gallagher is very strong. Timmy Baldwin does win the seat, and Tony Evers does not win the seat, although he does do all right. Now, again, the reason why we drew it like this is it's just not great for Democrats. I mean, if you look at the way things are done here, we're already putting in a lot of Republican areas into the second district. We're putting in these Republican portions of Sauk, Columbia, Lafayette, Greene counties. Greene is still a Democratic county, but there comes a line when when a state's you can't fix a state's geography. We did this with Republican states as well. We didn't try to draw a Republican seat in Massachusetts, even though you theoretically can. We didn't try to ensure perfect partisan parity in Washington, even though, in theory, 6-4 is much more fair in a state that goes 60-40 most of the time. 7-3 is kind of a little bit off. But sometimes the geography can't be helped. So the result of this map is it's a 6-2. But Democrats have two seats they could compete in. And Republicans only have two very strong seats here. They have 7 and they have 6. Democrats can compete in 5. They can compete in 1. They can compete in 3 and 8. If they can't win any of them, fine. But I think this is more than fair in terms of giving them any sort of chance in the seat. I mean, Harrison could comment on this as well, but there comes a point where you just cannot make decisions and violate redistricting principles. It's just not a fair thing to do. I mean, you can see here, putting the Senate race on, Democrats win all but 3 seats, 5, 7, and 8. That's pretty reasonable given how the state voted. Gubernatorial race in 2018, they win 2 seats, but these 2 are very competitive. The presidential race and the attorney general race is similarly competitive, but the presidential race, they've got a competitive seat around Milwaukee, which is going to certainly trend Democratic. There's not much you can do beyond that, I don't think. I don't know if Harrison has any additional thoughts, but that's just kind of where we're at.
Not particularly. I mean, most people would know that Wisconsin is a difficult state geographically. It's kind of in a way similar to Arkansas. It's very difficult in Arkansas to draw a Democratic seat if you wanted to draw a Democratic seat. It's possible, but it's not easy to do per se. So kind of like the African-American population in Arkansas is heavily scattered. It reminds me a lot of how the Democratic population in Wisconsin makes it geographically difficult to draw a completely fair map. Did you have the gerrymander on there to show?
We have it. Yeah, I'll pull up our gerrymander and redistricting radar to as an alternative of what an actual Republican gerrymander would look like, and what it would look like is pretty terrible for Democrats. It would not be 6. It would be 6-2, but it would be very safe 6-2.
Oh, I meant the Democratic gerrymander.
Oh, Democratic gerrymander. Sorry, yeah. Like, you can do this. It's horrible. I mean,
that's created by our master Adam Trencher.
Yeah, I think like Dave Wasserman did it. I think Dave Wasserman did a challenge where he asked people basically to draw enough Democratic seats by a certain margin, because it's literally impossible to make a Democratic map in Wisconsin that's as competitive as a Republican one. It's worth noting also, this is probably illegal because it makes the 4th much
Can you
more.
Actually open that up in Dave's?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Let's do that.
Curious to take a look at some of the seats.
Yeah.
And see if any of them dummy matter.
Yeah. Yeah, let's convert this to 2020 lines. Actually, no, let's not convert it to 2020 lines. Let's just put it on 20. Actually, yeah, we're going to convert it to 2020 lines. The data is probably going to be slightly off in terms of population disparity. It really doesn't matter too much. We didn't turn off water precincts. There's going to be a little bit of disparity, but it's nothing that can't be fixed. Really, this is just to show how it looks in 2020 and how it would look in other elections. Oh, come on. Oh dear. Actually, I gotta fix the population because it seems to be confusing water precincts. Yeah, we can't really show it, but really it is not. I mean, that's what you can do. It's not ideal, I don't think. I do want to answer one question here from Jacob Smith, who said, Hot take, there is no one way to draw a fair map. You can draw them in many different ways. Yes, that is the case, and that is the philosophy we use. But there are baseline standards we're not going to violate. We're not going to split up the city of Milwaukee. It's not reasonable. We're not going to split up. We're not going. I mean, a seat that has all of Waukesha County, but we're not just going to string together a bunch of cities that are Democratic and then, and then call it a fair map when it really doesn't represent a community of interest. That's a factor we rate pretty highly in our maps, and we haven't gone out of the way to make it. We certainly haven't gone out of the way to draw Republican seats in states like California when we easily could have. And real quick, I know we talked about this. Harrison and I talked beforehand. West Virginia. I will show our map really quickly because West Virginia is not really interesting because we know exactly what is going to happen in West Virginia. There are 3 congressional districts. First is represented by David McKinley, the second by Alex Mooney, the third by Carol Miller. Alex Mooney's seat is in the middle of the state, and it's going to be sandwiched by the first.
Toast. It's going to be divided north to south. You don't even need to see the map.
Yeah, and literally the problem with Alex Mooney is he is absurdly unpopular. He actually did worse. He did worse than Richard Ojeda did.
This is a good answer. In 2014, Nick Rayall was the incumbent Democrat in the 3rd district, and he lost by 10 points. But Alex Mooney only won his seat by 3 points in 2014.
Yeah, he's a carpetbagger. Nobody likes him. And so what will happen is that Carol Miller will get a safe seat, McKinley will get a safe seat, and Alex Mooney can move back to Maryland.
Yeah,
that's what it looks like if you're interested.
If they draw David Trone out and make that seat in Maryland the Republican seat, and then screw over Andy Harris, then Alex Mooney can run over to Maryland and win that seat.
Yeah. Again, we would show you a map, but there's literally nothing interesting about West Virginia. You can draw a state Senate map, which is perfectly fair and has exactly 0 Democrats in it. The state is very red. It is going to get redder. There's not a lot of areas Democrats can hope for. The seats won't be competitive, and Carol Miller and Dave McKinley will be very, very fine in both of their districts. I would be surprised if Mooney just does not straight up retire rather than face the indignity of losing a primary by 20 or 30 points, as would likely be the case.
Or more.
Because he's not popular anywhere. He's literally not popular in any portion of the district. He's winning because it's a Republican district.
But, and they still ridiculously underperformed in 2016 and 2018.
Yeah. Again, literally, Democrats spent money. They spent money in the 3rd district to try to make Richard Ojeda a thing. He lost by 13. He lost by 12.5. Alex Mooney only won by 11.5, and they spent nothing there.
Well, it's embarrassing. I'm not trying to be rude about it, but if you think about it, 2014 is the worst example. That was the closest. He only beat Nick Casey. He beat Nick Casey in that seat by just a couple points. Want to know
in a red wave?
Want to know the only reason that he won? The counties bordering Maryland, Jefferson and Berkeley County, and the whole eastern portion of the district. The rest of the district voted Democratic. The portion that's essentially fake Maryland is, it gave Mooney what he needed to win in that race. And that was a race that shouldn't have even been competitive. And because keep in mind, in 2012, the prior year, same district, Shelley Moore Capital won the seat with 70% of the vote. And in 2016, he had a close race again. He ran against a state representative named Mark Hunt. He couldn't crack 60% of the vote. And 2018 was the most embarrassing one of all. And granted, it was a Democratic wave year, but he was still underperforming in rural counties outside of Kanawha County. And he essentially, like Eric said, only won by 11 points.
Mm-hmm. Even in the last election, he still ran behind Trump by a fairly decent margin.
Yeah, if the Democrats had just put more money in 2018 into that race, it definitely would have been a better target than West Virginia 3. Same thing in 2014. That race was closer than West Virginia 3, even though Nick Rayall was an incumbent. But yeah, I think that really wraps up most of our discussion, and this is pretty much the end of Redistricting Radar, but you're going to be able to start watching our news show, The Campaign Trail, which I'm bringing back with Eric next week, and we're going to start with the 1824 election. We're going to hit all the big campaigns in that series for you. You can go watch our 1980 episode. I'll link that for you. You can go watch that now. Let me just link it real quick. That did very well. It was about the 2000 contest, my bad. But we did that, and we're going to bring back the series. So that is the playlist to watch. Thank
and
you.
also, if you've not already watched we'll post another one here, which is our Almanac special we did with several amazing writers, Jessica Taylor from Cook Political Report, and Lou Jacobson from PolitiFact, both of whom have contributed to the Almanac. We discuss everything relating to the Almanac and the 2021 and 2022 elections. So go watch that as well.
And
Redistricting Radar is done for now, but it's not. It's going to come back once we get the actual state maps coming forward. We do have a plan for a second season. We know you guys love this show, and we're going to ensure we do guarantee it will be coming back when there is more states and there's more things to go over.
Yep, we're going to be discussing each state as it releases its map next year.
Yep. We'll also probably dabble into state legislative maps to a degree, wherever possible. But yeah, that's just that's where we're at. And thank you guys again for watching the channel. Like the video if you like what we're doing. Subscribe to it if you like what we're doing. We're also on podcast platforms.
The playlist has all of our episodes, but
it's complete.
For the rest of this year, we're done with this. So thank you.
Yeah, it's complete. The playlist is complete. You can watch it from start to finish. It's probably going to take you a day or so to get through all of them.
It's going to be a long time.
Yeah, but it is there. If you ever feel like you missed the show, you can go back and watch it. We will be back. Trust us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out. We do have a Patreon as well. We have other ways you can support us if you like. But we do appreciate your support. Thank you for watching.
It's been a year in the making, too, because our first episode was last July. So
yeah, that's impressive. We got through it in a year. That's actually pretty good.
Yeah. All right. Good night, everyone.